The Warrens always prided themselves on being able to face dark forces from beyond. In various interviews, they talked about how they fought against vengeful spirits or entities that wanted to feed on human vitality. Their museum is, according to them, proof that on more than one occasion, they managed to come out victorious from the experience. And with a souvenir in between? However, in their mythology, there is an emblematic case in which their participation is rather bitter. Although they performed exorcisms and talked about what happened in books and on television shows, they always ended up admitting that they couldn't do much because of the people who had contacted them. Plain and simple, evil had survived their interference and even seemed to mock them. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. The story, which brings the fourth part of the Conjuring saga to life, is based on an extremely controversial case that starred this couple who have captivated pop culture for years, a couple as loved as they are hated. We previously did an in-depth report on the Warrens on this channel, covering both believers' and skeptics' perspectives. This time, we want to focus on a particular case to tell you about the supposed real events that inspired the latest film that delves into the lives of these controversial investigators. Welcome to the case of the Smurl family. Before we begin, I want to tell you that we've already made a video about the Warrens on this channel, telling their whole story, the behind the scenes, so to speak. We also made a video about the day Lorraine Warren died for my other channel, El Dia Que, and both videos did well. So if you want us to keep going with the Warren theme, write Warren down below in the comments. If over 1,000 people write Warren, are we going to analyze another famous case? We've already done the Amityville one, so you can suggest some of the other Warren cases. We have several to talk about. Let's begin. In the summer of 1973, much of Pennsylvania was trying to recover from the devastation of Hurricane Agnes. Among them, a family that set out to face the crisis, focusing on a new horizon. Jack and Janet Smurl, a working-class Catholic couple, decided to move into a duplex at 330 Chase Street in the quiet town of West Pistome. They weren't alone. Living with them were their 4 daughters, a dog, and Jack's parents. The living arrangement was meant to bring the family closer. After years of hardship, the new house, although modest, represented the promise of stability in the midst of a time of loss. The Smurl family was going through a rough patch. Yes, it's never easy for anyone to start from scratch, adapt to a new city, and try to regain some peace of mind after a natural disaster. But they believed this could be the prelude to a new, somewhat brighter chapter. However, that optimism would be cut short in just a few months when they discovered that there is something worse than a house destroyed by a hurricane, a haunted house. The property had 2 halves. Jack and Janet lived with their daughters on one side and Janet's in-laws on the other. It wasn't a new house, but an old building with worn wood and walls that showed damage from the passage of time. From the beginning, the place gave off a heavy atmosphere, hard to explain, but the family clung to the idea that they could turn it into a real home and the cradle of their redemption. The first weeks went by with a certain normality. Then, without much warning, unsettling details began to appear, almost imperceptible at first. It's worth making a clarification. Some sources state that all these abnormalities began without a trigger. They started from one day to the next, without explanation. And other sources point out that all this started when the Smurl wanted to do renovations in the house. They stripped paint from the walls and moved the floors and ceiling. When they started moving things, that's when it all began. There are 2 versions about this event. Either way, the only certainty is that there was a moment when some disturbing situations became part of the family's routine. A damp stain that appeared on the wall and spread irregularly, a sudden smell of rotten meat that disappeared in a matter of seconds, or a buzzing in the pipes for which no explanation could be found. Minor details, yes, but constant, as if something was intent on getting the family's attention. A bit confused, but believing there was no reason to panic, Jack attributed everything to the age of the building. Janet nodded and tried not to make a big deal out of it, convinced that any old house could have flaws. Janet confidently told her children not to let their imagination take over. But the signs soon intensified. Doors slammed shut in the middle of the night, lights flickered even though there was no storm, chaos and appliances seemed to work on their own. Some situations were difficult to explain with the usual arguments. So an uncomfortable silence, a mix of worry and uncertainty, settled among the Smurfs. Sometimes, the unusual noises were accompanied by footsteps and whispering voices that seemed to come from the empty rooms. A murmur so low that the family wondered whether they had dreamed it or if there really was someone else with them. The girls tried to escape from recurring nightmares and dark figures that slid through the hallways. And not only that, the feeling that something was watching them while they slept also became persistent among them, and they would wake each other up when they could no longer bear the fear. Even the strong-willed grandparents admitted to feeling a strange tension at nightfall. As if an invisible veil closed over the house. As if at a certain hour it became clear that they could live there, but that didn't exactly make them the owners of the land. What at first seemed like a house marked by the whims of antiquity would soon reveal itself as the setting for one of the most disturbing episodes in modern paranormal history. Number 330 Chase Street was no longer a home. It was a territory in dispute between the faith of a family and a darkness that would only continue to grow. What had begun as a series of annoying and strange incidents soon turned into an unbearable experience that dragged the Smurl family into a perpetual state of alert. As you might expect, this meant that the moods inside those walls were far from the best. Janet noticed that family arguments were becoming more frequent, that irritability was settling into daily life, and that everyone seemed to be under an inexplicable pressure. It wasn't only fatigue or moving stress, something else was slowly seeping into their lives. Jack clenched his fists, struggling to contain an anger that consumed him. The girls weren't sleeping. That caused them problems at school, and they had lost the ability to get along peacefully with classmates or other children their age. At dinner, their interactions were apathetic. The noises were there, but they tried to fight them by ignoring them. Obviously, this didn't help much. At one point, scratches appeared in the bathtub and in other places. They looked like they were made by huge claws, and they were in places where the family dog couldn't reach. Even so, they blamed him. Their need to deny what was happening was more than obvious. To do otherwise meant accepting something unexplainable was forming right under their noses. The nauseating smells became more hostile. They weren't just traces of dampness or faults in the sewage system. It was a penetrating stench that even made them dizzy. Jacques remembered that sometimes the stench mixed with an icy air that swept through the corners of the house, even when all the windows were closed. It was around that time that the whispers turned into screams, piercing wails that, in the middle of the night, seemed to come from deep within the house. Voices that didn't belong to anyone in the family and left a feeling of vulnerability in those who heard them, bewildered and powerless, not knowing what to do. But the worst part was when the physical attacks began. The shadows that moved from one side to the other had not only gained more presence, but had also become more solid and corporeal. The Smurls could even feel the shadows standing in front of them. And one day, Jack was forcefully pushed against a wall while he was fixing a broken appliance. Another time, Janet was scratched on the arm by an unseen force, leaving red, burning marks on her skin. One morning, something unseen violently threw the dog against a wall. The animal's cry was etched in everyone's memory, as proof that what was happening was not just a simple nightmare. Jack reported being sexually assaulted by an entity, a humiliating and traumatic event that pushed him further into his own mind. Janet, for her part, also reported being a victim. She levitated above her bed, paralyzed and terrified. These dark and disturbing episodes became increasingly difficult to share. The Smurf family slowly started isolating themselves from one another. And all of this happened gradually because these events took place in the house over a period of 10 years. The house had turned into a battlefield, and they were the victims of a force that seemed to have no limits, a force that subdued and weakened them. The police couldn't help them. The doctors couldn't help them. The pest exterminators couldn't help them. It was then that, exhausted and out of answers, the Smurl decided to seek help beyond the earthly. And that's how our story returns to the beginning. By then, the Warrens were already famous in paranormal investigation. He was a self-taught demonologist, and she was a clairvoyant and medium. They had been involved in such famous cases as Amityville, and their reputation made them the last hope for families who claimed to be under attack by demonic forces. In the same way, their critics already numbered in the thousands in those years. They accused the Warrens of being sensationalists, of taking advantage of confused people, and of profiting from the pain of others. They were called charlatans, and their television appearances were parodied by the most skeptical. That's why it was no surprise to anyone when they arrived at the house on Chase Street. From the moment they crossed the door of the Smurl family's house, the Warrens claimed to feel a dense, heavy atmosphere, as if something was surrounding them. Immediately, Lorraine, who was sensitive to energies, sensed what she described as a multiple presence. She would later state that she had identified several entities. On one hand, there were two female presences, one young and one old. Both seemed relatively harmless and not very powerful. But there was also a violent man, full of rage and with a horrendous past. According to what the medium could piece together, he was a man who, while alive, had been executed by his own wife. Already tired of being the receptacle for all his frustration, that being seemed harmful and filled with a lot of dark energy. Even so, it wasn't the most difficult problem they were dealing with. There was a fourth presence, a very special one. It was a demonic force that acted as the true core of evil, controlling the others as if they were pieces on a board. A higher entity had assembled its own paranormal army within those four walls. Ed recounted that in the midst of his investigations, he witnessed how the temperature in the house dropped sharply. In a matter of seconds, it chilled everyone present and made vapor come out of their mouths. He also spoke of a black mass that formed in the air in front of him, a kind of dense cloud that seemed to pulse with its own life, a mass that seemed to sniff him and study him carefully. That vision confirmed to Ed that what was happening there was not just simple suggestion. Something was watching them with the same curiosity with which they were seeking answers. Their verdict was clear. They had to act. The first thing they did, as usual, was to have a long interview with the owners of the house. They asked them about their beliefs and were particularly insistent with the younger members of the family. They wanted to know if at any point, even if just playing, they had tried to contact spirits. All the answers were negative. The Warrens concluded that the Smurl family had not provoked the demonic presence, more because they had moved into that house, which didn't seem to want to be shared. The big mystery was, did the presence only guard the home, or did it want to feed on the sanity of the innocent family? After Ed confirmed that his prayers wouldn't be enough to stop what was happening, the Warrens stated that it wasn't wise to wait another second. They had to act as soon as possible. It was time to perform an exorcism. Of course, the presence of the Warrens attracted the attention of both local and national media. Soon the Smurl case became the subject of headlines, reports, and debates. Some saw it as proof that the phenomena were real, others as a strategy to gain notoriety. The families, however, insisted that all they wanted was peace. Unfortunately, the mockery toward them came as quickly as the whole matter spread through newspapers and radio. The Smurl family became unwilling protagonists in a harsh conflict, a tale many followed with skepticism and a smile. The neighbors, intrigued by what was happening in the house, began to whisper. They said the new family was insane. Others began to suggest that the duplex was cursed. Although the Catholic Church, which the Smurl family was closely connected to, was among the first places they sought help, local priests had few solutions. They performed prayers and blessings in the house, but it didn't help. Do nothing? Unless we believe in another version, one that claims that, in reality, the place didn't have just one, but several exorcisms. It's said that when the initial attempts by local priests failed to stop the wave of phenomena that plagued the Smurl family, the Warrens insisted that a more radical intervention was needed. They needed someone with direct experience in spiritual battles. That's how Father Robert McKenna came into the picture, a traditionalist Catholic priest who carried out his ministry under a stricter line and was less accommodating to the official church. He was known for being involved in complex possession cases. Father McKenna arrived at the Chase Street duplex carrying the essentials: a crucifix, holy water, and the Roman ritual of exorcism. From the moment he walked through the door, he also claimed to feel an invisible resistance, a heaviness in the air, which he described as the demon's rejection of his presence. According to the Smurl family, his mere arrival caused the noises in the house to intensify. Obviously, someone was not happy with that visit. The first exorcism took place with the Warren family present. McKenna began with solemn prayers in Latin, invoking God's protection and the expulsion of evil spirits. Janet would later recall that as soon as the priest sprinkled holy water around the rooms, an unbearable stench of rotten flesh filled the house. The same one she had felt many times in recent years. Jack, for his part, swore he saw a dark shadow sliding down the hallway, as if fleeing from the light of But the entity didn't just escape or remain passive. While McKenna was reciting the words of the exorcism, insults began to be heard in a guttural, deep voice that didn't come from anyone present. The Warrens confirmed that they had heard those curses, while the girls cried clinging to their mother. In the following days, McKenna returned several times, repeating the ritual and reinforcing every corner of the duplex with prayers and blessings. Although after each intervention the family felt momentary relief, the evil seemed to return over time. Weaker perhaps, but still active and persistent in its intentions. The priest explained that it was a particularly difficult case where the entity had taken deep root, feeding on years of suffering and fear. Making things worse, the Smurl family discovered the entity followed them even on vacation, when they chose to go on television to discuss what was happening to them. The demon's retaliation was brutal, the physical attacks intensified, and for days on end, the furniture wouldn't stop moving. The Warrens slowly stepped away from the case. Ed claimed to have recorded the sounds of the entity manifesting on his recorder, but he refused to return to the site. Some say that he had felt real fear for the first time in his life. Others say that the Warrens only stayed long enough to squeeze their naive victims and then went on to look for new suckers. In fact, although they never charged the Smurl family for their services, the Warrens, together with Robert Curran, wrote a book telling the whole story of the family's ordeal, which brought them some sales and a large royalty check. After the story was adapted into a movie in 1991, the Smurl family became more elusive. They no longer had sympathy for the Warrens, even less for the priests, and much less for the journalists, who always seemed about to laugh in their faces. No one had been able or willing to help them. From 1987 to 1988, they were forced to accept what they never wanted. They weren't going to be able to get rid of the presence until they left that house for good. That home had never belonged to them, and it never would. The church performed a final exorcism around that time, controlling the entity, but it was already too late for the family. They refused to take more risks, and so just like that, the Smurl family disappeared from the public eye. However, the controversies surrounding it continued to grow. Skeptical investigators and local journalists tried to offer alternative explanations for the family's claims of supernatural phenomena. One of the main lines of doubt focused on the health of Jack Smurl. In later interviews, he himself acknowledged that in 1983 he had undergone surgery to remove fluid from his brain, a complication he had been dealing with since he suffered from meningitis in his youth. Before the operation, he had suffered episodes of short-term memory loss, which led some specialists to suggest that his perceptions might have been altered. Could some experiences he described be due to neurological after effects? But how did he explain that? The blows he received? How did he explain the fact that other family members saw what Jack saw? The critics also took the discussion to a broader level. Economic pressure, daily stress, and emotional confinement could have created a case of shared psychosis. Foliadox, a documented phenomenon in which several members of the same family end up believing and experiencing the same hallucinations due to mutual suggestion. The fact that the Smurl family lived for years obsessed with the phenomenon, recording every noise and every strange smell, reinforced this hypothesis. It also seems significant that they had just endured a hurricane, an experience that can break anyone's psyche. Others suggested that the media exposure and the close relationship with the Warrens had also contributed to clouding the story. The family, under constant observation and being the subject of rumors in the neighborhood, may have experienced psychological feedback. The more people talked about the haunted house, the more impossible it became to distance themselves from the phenomenon. However, these explanations never managed to completely dispel the mystery, even considering Jack's medical problems and the family tensions. The fact remained that multiple outside witnesses claimed to have witnessed unusual phenomena inside the house. It was this coexistence between solid testimonies and psychological theories that left the case in an ambiguous and fertile ground for debate. As we mentioned, in 1991 the Fox network brought this story to television with a movie of the same name based on the events, reinforcing the public's fascination with the case. Years later, the Conjuring franchise used the episode as inspiration for a new installment, confirming that the events on Chase Street entered popular culture as one of the most famous accounts of demonic activity in the United States. After the family left, new tenants moved into the duplex and reported no phenomena. Does this mean it was all a hoax? Or does it mean that maybe the entity was only interested in bothering the Smurfs and feeding on their fear? The couple tried to resume normal life over time. Jack, who passed away in 2017, maintained until the end that everything they described was real, that they never sought fame or money. Janet, for her part, always maintained that the entity was trying to destroy them as a family and break their bonds. She stressed that surviving was already a victory. One of her daughters, Karen, later pursued paranormal research as an adult, perhaps as a way to make sense of the suffering experienced throughout all those years. Today, the Smurfs case is the subject of documentaries, academic analyses, and debates in specialized forums. For believers, it is proof that there are plenty of cases where evil simply triumphs and only leaves when it wants to. For others, it's proof they're the most iconic supernatural couple. They turned anything that crossed their path into a business, destroying the hopes of those who trusted them to find solutions to real problems. In the meantime, they diverted attention from delicate situations that required deeper and more thoughtful approaches. But the legacy of the case is not only in these matters, but also in the unsettling questions that still resonate. What happens when the place that should give us refuge becomes the epicenter of horror? What happens when we can no longer trust even our closest circle? What happens when no one believes us anymore? And even worse, exploits our pain for entertainment, and just for some money. Without a doubt, it is at that moment when faith in humanity disappears completely and the forces of evil manage to claim victory.